secrets of the Underground Railroad. Escaping slavery was a tough decision for slaves to make, the choice whether or not to escape slavery for a possible better chance. However, the risk of getting caught, starving, or other obstacles was enough to turn many away. Not knowing quite where they were going, how they were going to get there, or what would happen, was tempting for some. The Underground Railroad was a network of abolitionists and ex-slaves that arranged transportation and hideouts for the runaway slaves. The first people to start helping slaves escape were the Quakers. Soon after, many Christian and anti-slavery societies started to form. Before long, in the 1840s, there were over 150,000 members joined in anti-slavery society. The majority of slaves wanted to escape slavery, but the risks and challenges of the journey turned most away. Those brave enough to escape had many dangers. If caught, the punishments were incredibly harsh. Slaves had terrible lives already, working all day, every day, with no freedom, breaks, or care. Slaves were often whipped and had just enough food to survive. With hard labor and no food, slaves were exhausted and ready for a new life. You may think that besides getting caught, the journey was easy, but there was much more to it. Slaves that were determined to escape would do almost anything. Most of the time, the safe houses would have very little space for the runaway slaves to be kept in, and they would end up being kept in cellars, tunnels, attics, secret rooms, and barns. Most of the transportation was done on foot. If you were lucky, you were able to get part of the travel done in a wagon or horse. Though there were some few cases where conductors who were very brave would bring slaves to freedom personally. Not getting caught was hard to get away with. Because more and more people were escaping, there were so many slave catchers on the lookout for runaway slaves. The weather was often very harsh, and with little food and in inappropriate clothing, slaves often would not make it through. There were other obstacles in the way too. It is an awfully long way from the south side of the States to Canada, and because most of the transportation was done on foot, slaves would wear themselves out walking for days. It is hard to imagine, but most of the time slaves were walking in unfamiliar lands, guided by nothing but the North Star, known to the slaves as the Big Dipper. Many slaves went to great heights to get to freedom. They would sometimes end up swimming and wading their way across the freezing cold Ohio River. Having to watch your friends and family of all ages being whipped right in front of your very own eyes was unbearable. It was cruel that the masters couldn't see how this made the slaves feel. However, not everyone felt this way about slavery. Many abolitionists and ex-slaves felt that slavery was brutal and helped slaves escape. One woman who helped in the Underground Railroad for years and helped hundreds of slaves out of slavery and into freedom was Harriet Tubman. She even returned down south to conduct the slaves north 19 times, even though if caught she would face serious consequences. She was a great person and led so many people to a better chance of life. She had a very successful run in the Underground Railroad. As she said, "I never ran my train off the tracks, and I never lost a passenger." Many other abolitionists also assisted in conducting slaves through the North. This showed great courage. If slaves were caught, they would be sent back to their masters, where they were severely beaten and sometimes killed. When civilians were caught helping slaves, the punishment was almost as bad. Most of the time, people caught helping runaway slaves were fined or put in jail. People had different views on the Underground Railroad. Many believed that African Americans were bred to be slaves, and that was the only thing they were capable of. Others believed that slavery was cruel, but knew that African Americans had no knowledge of how to live on their own and were incapable to provide for themselves. And there were the few that believed that slaves should definitely escape into freedom, and those were usually the people found working in the Underground Railroad. When slaves reached freedom, it was a huge weight off their shoulders. It was a relief to be free from the burden of hard work and beatings. In Canada, there was still discrimination against African Americans, but they were allowed to vote, own land, and had many other advantages. The railroad was a very successful route that led thousands of slaves to their freedom. In today's world, slavery still exists, and like the Underground Railroad, there are many organizations trying to help people out of it. They probably are not doing the same things to get them out, but they are lending money, supplying teachers for schools, and many other things. Some networks today are the NGO and GPAT. These organizations from today and the Underground Railroad should be praised and never forgotten, for they were there to help thousands of people who deserve better lives.